me for this presentation. Some very familiar names on the list of participants, and one in particular I'll mention in a time through the towards the end of the video presentation. Right, well, ringing simulators, well, they're very widely used these days as powerful teaching aids, but what were their origins? How far back in time do you really think they go? Well, in this presentation, I'm going to outline the history of simulators and mention some of the key players in their development. Keep an eye out for some famous names as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. So what is a simulator? It would actually help to define what a ringing simulator is, I suppose, at this point. There are in fact three types of ringing simulator. The first one is the ringing machine, which can just simply calculate and perform changes, and it makes bell sounds as it goes along. A ringing simulator takes this idea a little bit further and allows a human to ring with it as a teaching aid. This is normally done by feeding out all the bell sounds, and the ringer has to slot their bell into the bell sound into the gap that's left behind. I suppose you could say it's a bit like a bell ringer's karaoke machine. Now, the third type allows every bell in the tower to be connected to the simulator. So the simulator itself no longer needs to calculate any changes, but just simply makes bell sounds. And this allows for a completely silent practice. Well, actually, this third type of simulator is by far the oldest. This is a photo of a small house or servant's bell, which is part of what was known as the siege silent apparatus. And this one's from Huntram in Devon. Now, I've no idea how many were installed in towers around the country, but the first one was installed in about 1875, and that was at Sidwell's in Exeter. There were a 2400 rating of 10, which was lost on the 4th of May 1942 when a German bomb destroyed the church. So these little bells are placed around the ringing room walls, and they were triggered by a peg like this attached to the side of the headstock. This one's at Whittle in the woods in Lancashire. Now this peg was then engaged with this rocking lever. It would be pushed from one side to the other, and as it was pushed, it triggered a bell with a little wire. And this is one at Crawley. So it's operated a bit like a servant's bell or shop doorbell, but it didn't have the spring, so the bell only rang once and it didn't jangle. Now, its inventor was a certain Ephraim Siege. I love that name. And he was born in 1829 and died 6th of November 1895. And he was buried here at the Higher Cemetery in Exeter. Now, although he invented siege silent apparatus, which, allowing people to practice without disturbing the neighbourhood, he never actually protected it by taking out a patent. And so there are plenty of copies made by by many other people. A little bit of delving has found examples in a few towers, and I think the one at Ryde on the Isle of Wight is still operational. Others still exist in various states of repair or maybe disrepair. Places like St Stephen's, Rochester Row in London, Colwall in Herefordshire, one of the mechanisms is preserved on the ringing chamber wall. Until 1952, there was one at Great St Mary's in Cambridge, and this was reported in the first volume of Bell News in 1881. So they've made really good use of it over the years. And in fact, there's a report of a peal of plain Bob Major rung on it in 1897. Now, there may have been other peals rung on the siege apparatus over the years, but the only other definite example is this one. And this was rung at Glasgow Cathedral in 1922 and was rung with 2 cover bells, so it says. The footnote is very confusing, as there are 9 people in the tower having met short for a peal of triples. I have no idea what that's about. But the apparatus did require, in general, a lot of maintenance to keep them working. And because of this, many had fallen out of use. However, during the ban on ringing in World War II, several of these systems were brought back into operation. And the last one I know about that was still in use was this one at Glasgow, which was still in operation back in the 1980s. Since then, of course, simulators have become popular again. And there are probably, I think, about 500 towers in the world where simulators are now being used for teaching. Now, listeners to the Radio 4 Soap the Archers will, of course, know that even St Stephen's in Ambridge has got one. This photo of the actors was actually taken in the ringing chamber at Hanbury, near Droitwich. Now, even though it is a very much a minority interest hobby, bell ringing is in fact one of the oldest applications for the programmable devices we now call computers. Now, the very first machines to able to compute changes and perform them were mechanical, what are called dedicated computers. In other words, they were designed to do a specific task. They had hardware and software, just like modern computers. So the levers and gears, etc., made up the hardware, and the methods or the programs were set by, for example, putting a series of pegs in a rotating wheel or something. Now, two of these pioneering ringing machines still survive to this day. The first of these is the Carter ringing machine, which was first developed in the 1890s by Birmingham ringer John Carter, who was also known as a composer of methods and peals. And he was also a gun maker by profession and held patents on revolver design. Anyway, he kept enhancing the ringing machine design over the years. Early versions could write out methods, and later ones would even play changes on a piano keyboard. And after his death, the final version ended up in the Science Museum in Kensington, where it was sadly neglected. And in 1951, it was reported to be in a sorry state of repair when it was taken out of the museum by Douglas Hughes of the Whitechapel Foundry and brought back into use with the help of another ringer called Brian Price. Now, there's more on Brian later in this talk. After its repair, the Carter ringing machine was occasionally demonstrated at the Science Museum for a few years. Here is a sketch of some of the workings drawn by Mr. Carter and subsequently published in the Ringing World of 1950. It can ring on up to 12 bells and can handle bobs and singles. And the sounds it makes are created by solenoids hitting a set of handbells in a glass case. Now, the Ringing World of June the 21st, 1957, reports that before the bomb-damaged tower at St Mary le Bow was sufficiently prepared for the 1956 Whitechapel 12 to be installed, the Carter ringing machine was set up at the Whitechapel Foundry, and instead of being connected to handbells, it was connected to a much larger set of solenoid hammers on the upturned bow bells. And thanks to Mark Regan, here's a photo taken in the Whitechapel Foundry yard of the bow bells fitted with their solenoid hammers. Now, a two-course touch, Stedman Sinks, was rung on the handbells, and a recording was made of this. Now, the 628th Lord Mayor of London during 1956 was Sir Cuthbert Lowell Ackroyd, and the restoration of bow bells was his charity while he was in office. Now, the recording of the Carter ringing machine playing these bells was then played from loudspeakers placed in the St Mary le Bow Tower during the Lord Mayor's procession of 1956. And Mark seems to think this recording still exists, but he's not been able to track it down. The tower itself was still being repaired and can be seen without its spire in some of the Ealing comedies, like the Lavender Hill Mob. This street photo dates from 1957. Now, bow bells weren't actually rung until 1961, when the tower repairs were completed, and the bells dedicated at a service attended by the Duke of Edinburgh. There's actually a Pathé newsreel of this on YouTube. Just search for Bow Bells Peal Again, and you'll find it. Now, the first peal on the Carter ringing machine was John Carter's own composition of Stedman Sinks, and that was rung September the 7th, 1963, and called by John Chilcott, who at that time was both the secretary of the College Youths and ringing master at St Paul's. The Carter ringing machine is now in the Bell Foundry Museum at Loughborough and is owned by the Central Council. This photo shows it's partially disassembled. And here is it being demonstrated. It's actually quite compact. And you can see on the right there, it's a set of electronically hit handbells in the glass case. Ledbury ringer Alan Bagworth, who's in the centre of this photograph, used to be one of the stewards of the Carter ringing machine, and he used to help demonstrate it in the Bell Foundry Museum. And here's a video of it working, ringing Little Bob Maximus. I hope you can hear and see this okay, because sometimes these things don't work very well on Zoom, so try this. Well, there you go, an amazing piece of kit. Now, the second ringing machine I mentioned is this one, and this is the Woodhouse ringing machine. And this image is taken from the ringing world of March 31st in 1950. Now, the Woodhouse change ringing machine was invented by George Fraser Woodhouse of Sedbergh, Cumbria. And he built it in the 1930s after he'd retired as a science teacher. And he actually built 3 or maybe more of them. The only existing one is now owned by the Lancashire Association. Now, whether the others were scrapped or redeveloped into a next generation, I have no idea. Anyway, this machine was described in the ringing world of August the 10th, 1934, as being a wonderful invention. Here it is, and it can ring on up to 8 bells. And there's a gear wheel selected to set the number of changes in each lead. The method is then broken down into swap notation, which is the opposite of place notation, where the position of the pairs that swap is defined. Now, each swap is represented by a peg screwed into a rotating drum. The drum rotates forward 1 place for each change until it reaches the half lead, when it reverses and works backwards through the pegs again until it reaches the lead end. Very clever design. And here, hopefully, is a video of its working. I've never tried it. There we go. It's quite interesting to watch that, and just on its own right. Now, bobs and singles, they were possible by pressing down suitable keys at the right moment, and these would either stop one peg or bring another peg into effect. It could be connected to a typewriter to print out the rows, or even to a pen, which can draw out the blue line on a roll of paper. And here's a clip of half courses of Bristol and superlative major printed out onto the machine on a roll of paper. That's not bad for a mechanical device that's made some 90 years ago. The machine's got about 1,250 parts, all of which were made by Mr. Woodhouse. And he describes this machine in great detail in a book published in 1935. And I've got a copy of this book, and it was given to William Saunders of Coalbrookdale, which you might see at the top there. And it's autographed by Mr. Woodhouse himself, dated 25th of March 1935, and this book shows in great detail how his invention works. William Saunders, by the way, taught my late father Jeff to ring at Coalbrookdale, and he in turn taught me. And here's a page from the book sketching out some of the parts and how they operate. Now, it's probable that Mr. Woodhouse sent a copy of his book to none other than Dorothy L. Sayers, which she acknowledges in a letter dated 25th of January 1937 by saying, "Thank you so much for your letter and for your most interesting booklet about the change ringing machine. I remain overwhelmed with astonishment at anybody who could work out a thing like that." Dorothy L. Sayers' famous book about a murder mystery set in a bell tower, The Nine Tailors, that's published in 1934. So this is only 3 years afterwards. Now, Mr. Woodhouse would frequently demonstrate his machine to visiting ringers at Sedbergh up until the 1950s. He died a bachelor on March the 9th, 1957, aged 82, and his obituary was published in the Ringing World on page 189 of March the 22nd, 1957. There was an article in the Ringing World about the machine was written by Cyril Crosthwaite, and that appeared in the July 12th issue in 1963, and that described how the machine worked, and mentioned some of the modifications made by a Kendal ringer called Gordon Thwaites to make it ring spliced. Now, I did actually borrow this machine for a talk and a demonstration at the 2009 Hereford Ringing Course, as Alan Griffin, who's on the call tonight, will probably remember. And it was after that, it was then stored in a flat in Tewkesbury for a few months. It's now kept properly at St Andrew's, Sedbergh, in a temperature-controlled environment. Now, another person I have to mention, of course, is Charles Babbage. And he started working on his mechanical computer in about 1822. And he's credited with inventing the first mechanical computer structures that eventually led to more complex electronic designs, although he never actually got his machines working in his lifetime. Now, all the essential ideas of modern computers are, in fact, to be found in his analytical engine. In 1991, a functioning difference engine was actually constructed from his original plans and built to tolerances achievable in the 19th century. And the success of the finished engine indicated that Babbage's machines would have worked had he been able to get it finished. Now, along with the somewhat better known Jacquard loom, the Carter and Woodhouse ringing machines must be some of the world's first programmable machines ever to be made to work. Now, their first electronic computers were huge machines which took up vast amounts of power and space and had far less computing power than the average modern pocket calculator. The Ferranti Manchester Mark I machine, this one, ran its first program on June the 21st, 1948, and is now acknowledged to be the world's first stored program computer to operate. This prototype was dismantled in 1950 and replaced by a commercial production version in 1951. Now, one user of this machine in 1953 was a ringer called Brian Price, and he was using it for ringing purposes when the opportunity arose. Now, it's highly possible that Brian Price collaborated with Alan Turing, who was in fact the deputy director of the computing laboratory there at the time. Now, Alan Turing, as we know, is the person behind the world's first electronic computers at Bletchley Park, which were used to break the German wartime ciphers. And he is credited with inventing the structures which all modern computers use. Now, there's one sentence in the book, Alan Turing, The Enigma of Intelligence, written by a guy called Andrew Hodges, which states somewhat whimsically, maybe, he had in particular a bell ringing program, bell ringing, working through every possible permutation. Whom did the bell toll? Ask not. There you go. But Roger Bailey here, the late Roger Bailey, who worked at Imperial College in London, wrote an article which he called his Shaggy Dog Story on this subject for the ringing world in 1998. Now, Brian Price was pioneering the use of computers for peal composition. And in particular, he was searching for the holy grail of compositions, that, of course, being a bobbed only peal of Stedman triples. This is Yarkhill Church in Herefordshire, birthplace of Fabian Stedman himself. Now, it's been long known, in theory, that an extent of Stedman triples could be obtained without using singles, but no composition had ever been found. Then it was actually only in 1995 where Bob's only compositions were actually produced by Philip Saddleton and Andrew Johnson. So peal composition is actually one of the earliest computer applications of any kind, and probably one of the very first non-numerical applications as well. By non-numerical, I mean that ones that didn't just carry out mathematical calculations such as addition and subtraction. It's not surprising that Brian Price would be the man to achieve this first, as he had already developed an interest in ringing machines and had published a number of articles on the subject in the ringing world of 1950. The series begins on March the 17th with an extensive description of John Carter's machine, and then it goes on to describe Mr. Woodhouse's machines. The articles also cover Brian's own machine, which he built, aged 37, while working as a maths teacher. Now, it used post office telephone uniselector relays to store the changes. It was over 4 foot tall and weighed about 300 weight. It could print out a blue line on a roll of paper and had about 288 buttons for the selection of methods. Now, there's a separate article on it in the Ringing World of December the 9th in 1961. He also mentions a machine built in 1935 by the Compton Organ Company of Acton, which used electric organ technologies to synthesize bell sounds, and it could ring only octave treble bob major. And when installed at Albury in Surrey, it was said that the bell sounds could be heard 12 miles away, but complaints were caused because the ringing was just too perfect. And as a composer, Brian developed some pioneering peal compositions, including the first composition of Cambridge Major to come round with a singular wrong. This was rung for the first time at St Michael's in Southampton on January the 18th, 1947, called by Charles Kippin. Now, for this 1998 Ringing World article, Roger Bailey managed to track down Brian Price, who coincidentally worked part-time and semi-retired at Imperial College in London. Now, Brian's interest in ringing had waned due to poor hearing, and also to the fact that he thought nobody was interested in his odd bob Stedman compositions. Now, Roger managed to rekindle Brian's interest in ringing, and Brian began ringing and composing again, notably some novel tenors together peals of Cambridge Major, which, apart from his 5090, these were the first few compositions of Cambridge since Middleton's, which was originally run on the 11th of February 1873 in Bennington. Now, Brian occasionally rang at Willesden, but lived in Thailand for much of the year, and he died in 2012. Now, it turns out that Andrew Hodges, the author of Alan Turing's biography, found out about the bell ringing program directly from Brian Price, hence its entry in the book. Now, another early use of computers for bell ringing purposes was at the Royal Radar Establishment, RRE. It was a government research establishment, and that was based in Malvern. And this took place about 1950. Now, one of the engineers who had helped to build the station's TRIAC computer was a ringer called R.H.J. Carter, Ron Carter. And he actually programmed this TRIAC computer to perform changes. And it would produce a series of beeps out of a loudspeaker and could ring on any method it was programmed with, on up to 12 bells. This is a photograph of the operating console of the TRIAC computer. The computer itself occupied several rooms in this building. The arithmetic unit alone occupied a space in one room, some 14.5 meters by 5.5 meters. Now, I knew my dad had got a recording of this TRIAC computer generating change ringing, and just recently I managed to find the cassette tape hidden in the box in the attic. So here is a recording of what is the earliest electronic bell sounds ever being rung to grants to triples. Now, these days, of course, electronically generated bell sounds are very common. So remember, what you've just heard is some 70 years old. Now, at one stage, the TRIAC computer was programmed to play music, and this was the very first computer synthesized music ever. And this is actually recorded on the reverse side of the cassette tape I mentioned a moment ago. Now, while on the subject of other ringing machines, the Ringing World of December the 26th in 1958 had an article by Teddy Barnett describing a change ringing machine designed by Professor R.J. Walker and Mr. Kiefer, Mr. J. Kiefer of the Mathematics Department of Cornell University, that's near New York, and built by Donald Stevens. Now, I wonder if this machine still exists. Now, apparently Cornell Library holds many ringing books, including a 1733 edition of Campanologia Improved. Would have been brought back from England by Andrew Dixon White, who was Cornell's first president, and he'd spent 3 years from 1853 studying in Europe and may well have encountered change ringing during his time. Now, this is St Matthias in Malvern Link, where I learnt to ring in 1977. George Morris, who was for many years the power captain, also worked at RRE, government establishment, and he tells me that he used the same post office telephone uniselector relays as Brian Price used, and he made a box that would ring Cambridge Minor, and that was sometime in the 1960s. Now, he and fellow link ringer Jerry Edwards, also at RRE, they wrote programs in a language called Albol, and they were using that to prove touches of Grant cicadas on the REAC computer. Now, the REAC computer replaced TRIAC in 1962. And REAC was the UK's first solid-state computer, which used transistors instead of valves and was far more reliable as a result. Now, my father, Jeff, who died just recently, aged 92, he wrote his first ringing program in 1969 on the RRE computer in a language called Fortran. And this would produce a list of rows based on place notation. And in doing this, he taught himself to program a computer. Now, from time to time, some really interesting articles will appear in the Ringing World. And this issue from July the 20th, 1973 was one such issue. Actually, there are two reasons why it's of interest to me. As you've been told earlier, I'm the organizer of the Tewkesbury Shield, and this issue contains the write-up of the very first Tewkesbury Shield competition. And on page 583 is this article by somebody, A.R. Carter. And it describes the maths behind computer proof of touches based on an algorithm which would generate a unique index number from any change. Now, that index number is then used to access an element in an array of numbers. Now, if that element has already been found, then clearly the touch is false. This is clearly a process ideally suited for computers to perform, and a modern PC can generate and prove a whole peal in a tiny fraction of a second. Now, I'm sure there are many other ringers attempted to make ringing machines or to write programs on early computers. In fact, the Central Council Secretary in 1970, Cyril Vatten, wrote a letter to the ringing world on January the 9th, offering to act as a clearinghouse, as he called it, for all the different developers. And at that time, there were probably quite a few. Change ringing then, both performing and calculating changes, is therefore one of the earliest electronic computer applications of any kind, as well as mechanical computers. So far, most of the efforts in computers have been put into proving ringing. Now, the first dedicated electronic ringing simulators, which could also perform ringing, were made by Peter Cummings of Camelford in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And these were demonstrated by Peter each year at the Hereford course, where he was invited by Wilf Morton. And here's a photograph of Peter and his wife Evelyn. Now, Peter was an absolutely fascinating and very clever person. During World War II, he was a volunteer reserve officer in the Royal Navy with the rank of lieutenant, and he was seconded to bomb disposal. But his technical knowledge was such that he was able to contribute significantly to the safe recovery and disposal of German magnetic mines. And on the 29th of October in 1940, he found himself at the sharp end of the latest threat, and that was acoustic mines. Now, these mines would sit on the seabed and would arm themselves when they reached a depth of 16 feet. And even the tiniest sound or disturbance would cause them to explode. Now, Peter was sent to the river Ogmore near Porth Paul to recover a mine which closely resembled the magnetic mines that had been found up to this point. And nearing midnight, he and Lieutenant Sidney Baker found this mine between the high and low water marks. And noticing that the primer release had not operated, but the retaining pin was missing, he simply put a pencil in the hole and made it, well, safe, if that's a word you can use when it comes to an explosive. Anyway, this turned out to be the first ever acoustic mine recovered, and it was taken to HMS Vernon, and that was the Royal Navy's mine investigation branch for disassembly. And it was used to develop countermeasures against this type of mine, which included putting underwater speakers on minesweepers to detonate the mines remotely. And Peter was decorated the King's Commendation for brave conduct. Well, the one source I found says he was awarded the George Medal, but I can't find this, can't verify this at all. Now, the Germans would place booby traps in some of their mines to counter attempts by HMS Vernon staff to capture them. And one exploded in a mining shed at HMS Vernon on 6th of August 1940, killing an officer and 4 ratings and seriously injuring a number of other personnel. So to avoid a repetition of this disused quarry near Petersfield in Hampshire was named HMS Myrtle, which is short for Mine Investigation Range, and that was used for examining mines. Now, Peter Cummings also helped make safe many delayed action landmines in places like Coventry and Liverpool, but he probably never got the recognition he deserved for this work and for saving many hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Now, after the war, Peter worked with Barnes-Wallis. So following the terrible death toll of the air crews involved in the famous Dambusters raids, Barnes-Wallis made a conscious effort never again to endanger the lives of his pilots. So his pioneering aeroplane designs were extensively tested in model form, including this double-decker plane. And this is decades before the A380. And Peter helped develop the radio control equipment for flying the prototype models. He also put his radio control ideas into practice on model boats as a hobby. And the front cover of an edition of Model Engineer magazine in 1949 shows him with his BUKW, which was described as being remarkably controllable. Now, at this time in the 1950s, there was a lot of interest in model boat navigation competitions, where a sailing boat or a motor-powered boat would have to steer unaided around a course set out on a boating lake. And this would usually involve clockwork, timers to move the sails, if it was a sailing boat, or rudder, to follow a specified course. Of course, Peter came along with his radio control boats and won every competition he entered. That killed the competition off, literally. Now, after Barnes-Wallis, Peter went on to start a business for controlling scaffolding lifts on building sites, and he called that control developments. And it must have been in the early 1970s that Peter's doctors warned him that for health reasons he should leave London and slow down. So with his wife Evelyn, he moved to Camelford in Cornwall. And Evelyn started ringing here, Landtakers by Camelford first, and Peter soon followed. And frustrated with the lack of opportunity for change ringing in that part of Cornwall, he started experimenting with machines to help him learn. Now, the early ringing simulators he built in the mid-1970s didn't use a computer to calculate the rows, but they were made up using what's called hardwired logic. And that's a technique based on a series of electronic true and false answers. And it might be thought as an electronic translation of the old Carter and Woodhouse ringing machines. I don't know if he's aware of their existence or if he knew they were around, how they worked, but he may just as easily come up with his own machines entirely on his own. Now, the sounds made were synthesized bell sounds made up of several decaying notes per bell using what was called a top octave chip, and that was found in electronic synthesizers of the day, like the Moog synthesizer. Peter's main contribution, however, was to provide the facility for human input, making it into a true simulator. The operator would simply unplug the signal, which would command his bell to ring, and would plug in a sensor mounted on the bell frame instead. Now, in the early 1980s, Peter redesigned his simulators to make use of a 6502 microprocessor. Of notes to programmers, here, there's the 6502s he used. He programmed them directly into hexadecimal machine code by hand, and he didn't even use an assembler. On the 8th of January 1983 at Torman in Torquay, a court appeal of Bob Miner was run on one of Peter's simulators with Peter in the band. And I think this is the most likely to be the very first ever simulator performance. Now, while I was at college in Plymouth between 1984 and 88, I used to meet Peter every fortnight at Callington for the local surprise practice. And we spent many hours talking simulators in the pub, this very handy pub, the Bull's Head, after ringing. At home in Camelford, he had a huge workshop which was perched down a steep slope below his house, a few yards above the River Camel. And he had machines, milling machines, lathes, an electronics assembly area where his simulators were made. And there was an intercom to the kitchen, which allowed his wife Evelyn to call him in for supper. In the house, he had a 100-weight dumbbell, training bell in the attic. And that had a rope downstairs in the hallway. And he spent many hours practicing. Now, because he did most of his ringing and listening to his simulators, this meant that he had certain thresholds, striking and of speed, which he had to be within. Outside these limits, he simply couldn't cope. And I've seen him on the light 10 at Exeter, that's just the 2800 weight 10 at Exeter Cathedral. He was unable to ring rounds because it was too slow for him. But I've rung an excellent peal of 8 splice, surprise major with him. So with less than perfect ringing, Peter was really unable to, often unable to fit in with the band. And this was much to the annoyance of the group tutors on the Hereford ringing course, where he would come as well to demonstrate his machines each year. So clearly too much ringing on a simulator is a bad thing. Now, Peter made very many refinements to the designs over the years. This one is at a Mark 8, and it's complete with a wooden carrying case. And if you look on the front, you can see the array of wires which enabled the user to choose which bell sounds were made by the machine and which were made by a tide bell with a sensor. The place notation was entered on the buttons on the left. This one is a Mark 16 and was made for the Central Council's Education Committee by Peter. And it has several methods already built in, so you don't need to have a degree in hexadecimals to be able to type in the place notation. Now, Peter made about 30 machines, I think, in total, installed at churches such as Keele, Tavistock, Chalfont St Giles, and Hurst Pierpoint, and Bromham as well. And remarkably, the last few of these are still in use, although I understand from John Babbage that the one at Chalfont is on its last legs. Several other machines, including the early versions, were left to the Central Council in Peter's will when he died. And I remember inspecting them in the former Birmingham Science Museum in Newhall Street. Who remembers that, eh? I went up there with my father and with Alan Bagworth. Now, this Birmingham Science Museum, it closed in about 1997 and was emptied in about 2002, about the same time as the think tank in Curzon Street opened. Now, Peter's machines are now at the Ferranti Museum in Loughborough, along with the Carter ringing machine. And I think 2 of them, one or 2 of them anyway, are still operational. Home computers before this, which is the Sinclair ZX80, and I've got one of these, It came out in 1980, and home computers before that were really quite rare. My father first purchased our first home computer in 1978. And this was a kit based around an 8080 processor. This processor is the predecessor of all modern PC processors. This computer had a massive 1K of memory, but no backup facility, which meant that the only way to save a program was to literally write it out on a piece of paper and retype it again next time it was needed. However, despite these constraints, my father was able to write a program that would bring touches of plain Bob Major. These calls being entered using a couple of Morse code keys, one Morse key for Bob and one for single. And I remember Steve Coleman having a play with this one evening, and can even remember the touch of Bob Major he called, wrong fifths, 3 ends and home. The year 1981 saw the launch of the BBC microcomputer, and I spent all my pocket money on one in 1982. And I first wrote my first ringing programs in BASIC on my Beeb over the next year or so, which would perform changes on up to 12 bells from placer stations stored as data programs in the data statements in the program. And on the 1985 Hereford ringing course, where I was invited to be a helper, as well as Peter Cummings, Alan Griffin, who's here tonight with us from Blockton, he'd also been invited by course organizer Wilf Morton to demonstrate his BBC ringing software, and also that of Ian Vincent, John Heaton and John Norris. Anyway, I told Alan that I too had written some ringing software, and he was very good, and he said he'd like to see it. So the very next day I brought in a cassette tape with the program saved on it. That was how it's done back in those days. Anyway, Alan, I think, was very impressed with what he saw and heard. With a clock speed of just 2 megahertz, the BBC computer, when running its BASIC interpreter, was a very slow computer in some ways. And my first attempts to write ringing programs suffered from this. In the first programs I wrote, the next change was calculated in the gap between ringing the previous one and starting the next. Now on 12 bells, when the ringing was sped up, but not by much, and there were lots of slots to make, this sometimes caused a delay in the rhythm because the amount of calculations that were needed. It was a striking error, and that was acceptable to me. So the solution to this was to separate the two functions of calculating and performing the changes using interrupt written code written in the 6502 assembly language. Now the main BASIC program would now calculate the next change and wait. And every time a bell had to ring, an interrupt would come in, bell sound was made, and the main program would then resume. And this could happen even if the next change hadn't even been calculated. So once all the bells in the change had rung, the main program would then spring back into life, calculate the next one, and then go to sleep again. The result was that calculating the next change could take as long as it took to perform the previous one, which was ample as any speed of ringing on such a perilously slow computer. Now, sometime in 1985, I added the facility for an external bell to be connected to us, just a single bell, to connect to the BBC Micro to be used as a proper ringing simulator. And this required another level of interrupts written in assembly language linked to the basic program to scan the sensor. Now, I rigged up a bicycle wheel with a 2-pound weight tied to the spokes and mounted on a shelf in the garage at home as a crude but effective dumbbell. I spent quite a few hours ringing it. About 1986, I built a much larger dumbbell in the attic, and that was made out of 4 mini cylinder heads and a large solid wooden wheel. And this used to get rather well used, and not just by me. Tim Barnes, who now is in New York, once stayed with me for a few days and rang a quarter each of the standard 8 on it in that time. Now, I also produced an EEPROM-based version of the program, and that was plugged inside the BBC Micro, which would then download the program immediately into the computer's memory when star bells was typed. And this removed the need to take cassette tapes or big chunky disk drives to the tower for teaching sessions. I believe, Alan, you might correct me later again, but you still use a BBC Micro running star bells under normal circumstances at your weekly learners practice, Bloxham. And so I think you must have the record of the longest continued simulator user. Anyway, Alan encouraged me a lot when I needed it as a teenager, and even sold my programs on my behalf. So I'm very, very grateful for Alan's input into my simulator ringing career. Now, I was by no means the only person using a BBC Micro for ringing purposes. Andrew Craddock adapted a program called Cyril, which stands for Simple Ringing Language, And he adapted it in about 1984 for the Beeb, and he called it Microcivil. And this was a powerful peel-proving program, which even on the slow BBC computer could still prove a peel of major in just a couple of seconds. It was a very clever program. Phil Tremaine wrote a series of articles in the ringing world on how to teach your computer to ring as well. And there were many other people using their home computer to training for ringing purposes. Now, the sounds that the BBC Micro produced in its 3-channel sound hardware weren't all that good, but I was able to develop a technique of overlapping the decaying pings over these 3 sound channels, which made a much more pleasant effect, perhaps a bit like handbells maybe. But I still wasn't really happy with the bell sounds I was listening to, and I realized the way forward was to use digitized real bells. Now, by 1990, I'd made a working prototype using homemade printed circuit boards etched in ferric chloride in the garage by my father. That's nasty chemical, that. Anyway, this is long before most PCs had sound cards. So all the digitizing and then playing back at these bell sounds had to be done on specifically designed and built equipment. The sounds I used to start with were the bells of Morven Link, but I also managed to make recordings of Worcester Cathedral. There were other things I could do with my digital bell sound box, which nobody had ever done before. This included retuning whole rings or even individual bells in an out of tune ring. And I could make recordings of the results to show what the bell hangers could achieve with selective retuning. I could also augment rings of bells electronically, and I was able to produce recordings of 16 power bells ringing some months before St Martin's in the Building was installed in 1991. Now, have a listen to this 30-year-old recording of Worcester Cathedral bells as a 16. So that was pioneering stuff in some ways, fun. My early digital experiments were demonstrated at the Hereford Artisan Guild dinner. It was held at Little Hereford Village Hall. That's a village on the Herefordshire-Shropshire border. And that was in about 1991, where I was guest speaker. And I had a couple of electronic handbells borrowed from Peter Cummings. They were basically handbells, but the clapper operated a switch mechanism rather than hitting the bell itself. And also had that 2-pound bicycle wheel dumbbell, and it was perched rather impressively on tables on the stage in this village hall. And I could demonstrate that by turning the knob on this box, that bells of different weights could be simulated. The changes were again calculated by my trusty BBC computer. Now, ringing handbells that sounded like Worcester Cathedral tower bells was quite fun, but not half as much fun as that bicycle wheel dumbbell. Now, having demonstrated it myself, I invited a couple of audience members to have a go. Neil Bennett, who you probably know as one of the band who rang the extended major at the Bell Foundry, he rang it perfectly. But Lempster Dave Thompson's various attempts had the audience in stitches, and I think he still gets teased about it to this day. About this time, Peter Cummings developed his own digital sound hardware using the digitized sounds of Worcester Cathedral that I provided, and I would occasionally owe him a set of EPROMs with these bell sounds programmed on them from time to time. And I think several of his top octave chip simulators with their decaying pings were upgraded with my digital sounds. Peter died in 1997, and his obituary was published in the Ringing World of April the 18th of that year. Now, I developed my own standalone simulator, the Ringleader, and there's one at Northfield, I think, isn't there, in 1991-92. And the first one of these was actually sold to Eric Taylor at Leckhampton in Cheltenham. And this box used the same 6502 processor as the BBC computer, and that is by Peter Cummings. And it had 12 digitized bell sounds from an artificially augmented Morven Link, or the real 12 at Worcester Cathedral. And there was a small liquid crystal display on the top to show the changes and other messages. And it had a library of about 70 methods and could ring on 5 to 12 bells. Now, at each year's Hereford Court from about the mid-1980s, I was invited to demonstrate my simulators, initially the BBC and then eventually the Ringleader. And I had a training bell at the top of a scaffold tower. This is one of the later versions of it. And I'd spend hours and hours letting people have a go on it as part of the Hereford course timetable. It was absolutely brilliant to watch people progress on it, even with a few minutes of usage. I don't do this anymore, but the bell itself ended up being installed at Bridgewater. In fact, there's another pensioned off training bell of mine in one of the small towers at small west towers at Melbourne in Derbyshire. And the original bicycle wheel is, I think Alan might still correct me on this, still used by one of the young ringers at Bloxham. The dumbbell from my attic in Malvern is now in pieces at the bottom of the tower at Strentram. But instead of resurrecting it, I'm toying with the idea of getting one of Matthew Higgins' training bells to Strentram instead. The Matthew's training bells are, in my opinion, by far the best and the most realistic I've ever known. This is a picture of the one installed at Tewkesbury Abbey. Now, dumbbells, or training bells, as you should call them, otherwise you're not applicable to getting the VAT back, they're to be found in many towers these days. Now, in late 1993, at Pagham in West Sussex, 2 were installed next to their 700-weight spring of 6, enabling 8-bell ringing to be practiced at a 6-bell tower using one of my ringleader simulators. This wasn't a unique situation. There were places like Tavistock, and for a while Louth did this, but at Pagham, not only did they ring a quarter peal of Grants to triples in their 6-bell tower, but in 1994 they went so far as to ring a peal of Rutland, publishing it in the ringing world as being run from a Pagham society. And there was no footnote. Sadly for the band, their ruse was discovered, and the Central Council threw it out, as the rule for peals at that time was for peals of major to be rung on 8 bells and not 6 bells and 2 dumbbells. Never mind, not worth a try. In 2000, the 6502 processor, you can see at the bottom middle of this picture of a ringleader processor board, was becoming impossible to obtain. So I redesigned it about a different processor, the 8051. And I rewrote the entire program for this different processor. Now, in 2002, the chip I used to generate the digital bell sounds became obsolete, so I redesigned it again. In 2004, other components were getting hard to get, so I decided I just couldn't justify another redesign phase, so I had to stop making them altogether, sadly. But by this time, anyway, PC hardware is becoming relatively cheap and could easily outperform the sounds that were produced by the ringleader anyway. And I was supplying many PC-based simulator systems and very rarely a ringleader one, so it sort of made sense to drop the ringleader. I've made 35 of them over the year. Some of them are still used. There's one at Bermondsey, another at Bolsham in Cambridgeshire, and the one at my home tower, Tewkesbury Abbey, gets used when there's a concert downstairs on a practice night, and in Holy Week as well, under normal circumstances. Now, the way in which real bells are connected and detected has also changed. Peter Cummings had a dual target system, which used an optical sensor, or photohead as he called them, to give a signal at the point in the swing of the bell when the clapper would normally hit. This is a picture of the bell with mouth downwards, but you can get the idea. Now, unfortunately, there are 2 such points, handstroke at the top and backstroke at the bottom, which means that the system has to reject every other pulse. It has to divide the pulses by 2. And this means it's possible to get out of step. The effect being that the bell would strike when your ringer's hands went down past their nose and not upwards past your nose, when it should happen. Another feature of this type of system was that the faster the ringing, the slower the bell appeared to strike. And as you got the bell even faster and well off the balance, it would actually stop striking altogether with the bell still maybe 3/4 of the way up. Now, the new technique I developed in the 1990s to get around this problem was to use a photohead to mark the bottom dead center of the swing of the bell, and then have a software-controlled delay from the bottom dead center to the point in the swing of the bell at which the clapper would normally hit. Now, this never gets out of step, and it's easy to set up for correct striking. It also allows for lowering and raising in peal, but it doesn't allow for chiming, although having said that, some rather clever PC software now does allow chiming to be emulated as well. Now, when it comes to improving the quality of ringing, a simulator really is one of the best tools to develop your listening skills. PC-based ringing simulator programs have been around for a number of years now. Chris Hughes and Simon Feather brought out a DOS-based simulator program for PC called Able in 1993. And when in 1998, a Windows version was being developed, I got in touch with Chris about linking Able to the hardware I was producing for the Ringleader. Now, as part of this new version, we developed a protocol which used my multi-bell interface to link up to 12 real bells on a single serial port on a computer on a PC to make it into a real ringing simulator. So overcame the limitations of the PC hardware, which meant you had only 4 bells per COM port. Now, Able is by far the most popular ringing software available. There's even a version for your mobile phone, of course. As you know, there are other programs available. Eric Ballard produces Bell Tower. Doug Nichols produces Virtual Belfry, which is this one. One mode which Virtual Belfry offers is an overhead view of the bells as they're rung, which is really clever, complete with high quality stereo sound. And these are the bells of Hobart Cathedral in Australia. Well, what are the future? Computers and ringing are inseparable, and there are just far too many examples of this to mention here. One example I will mention is where ringing and computer technology meet is at a marking striking competitions, and there's a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes on this. Now, the National 12-Bell competition have been doing this for a while, and Hawk here, as it's now called, is quite widely for marking striking competitions, analysing practice night striking, and so on. Nowadays, the internet has loads of ringing content on it, and there are even some online composition engines for things like half-lead splicing and Stedman pricking. The online Dove's Guide is absolutely marvellous example of the use of the internet for the benefit of ringers. Complib is another one, which is a really good resource as well. Email groups, Facebook groups, they're becoming very popular. And over the last year, Ringing Room and Hanwell Stadium, they're pretty much the only way that people can get their ringing fixes. There's of course Zoom, of course, which allows you to see and hear me tonight. Things have certainly come along a very long way since Messrs. Carter and Woodhouse were around. I'm interested to know what they thought of it all, their pioneering work. Well, many thanks really to the contributing sources to this talk, including Bill Purvis, who has a real interest in ringing machines, and when he became steward of the Carter ringing machine, he was the only member of the Central Council who was a non-ringer. Quite an interesting thing to be. He has more now recently learning to ring, and he's also transferred his allegiances from the Carter ringing machine to the Woodhouse machine, and he now helps look after that one at its home in Sedbergh. Back issues of the Ringing World have been a really good source of information using the DVD versions. So that concludes my talk, and hope it's been informative. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and if anybody wants to unmute themselves and contribute, that'd be very, very, very good. See what we can do.
David, thank you so much for that. It certainly was informative. I think you've given us a fascinating history, not only of ringing simulators actually, but of technology actually, the development of technology, over the decades. So thank you for that, and yeah, I say a really fascinating talk. The chat box has been very quiet, but I've noticed a couple of people have unmuted themselves. Before I invite anyone to speak, David, you talked about a couple of people in the audience who might want to contribute. I think Alan Griffiths and
Alan Griffin was, yeah, Alan Griffin's there. He was mentioned 2 or 3 times in this. I'd be interested on his contribution, because I did this talk originally for the Hereford Ringing course about 12 years ago, and Alan was in the audience there. I'm sure he was. So he's looking at his screen now. If he can work out how to unmute himself, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Alan.
Yeah. So yeah, if Alan or anyone else wants to sort of contribute rather than ask a question, but please, warmly invite you to do so.
He's looking at his screen.
Not necessarily put you on the spot. Whilst waiting for any contributions, I've noticed Phil's unmuted himself.
I've managed it.
Oh, well done, Alan.
I'm here. Good to hear you, David.
Yeah.
And yes,
that was very interesting. Thank you for all your mentions of me. But I'm still using David's program Bells, Bloxham, at least. Well, I haven't been for the last year because we haven't been ringing. But every week I've actually used the BBC computer as a simulator to teach people. And the simulator is absolutely brilliant for teaching people, because people can hear what it ought to sound like.
Super.
Right,
Thank
yeah.
you, Alan. Thank you. Super. Thank you. Phil, I think you were.
Yes, I've got, one or two mostly anecdotal contributions to make. I think I could claim a little bit of credit for the widespread use of dumbbells, because we had our first Cummings simulator at Keele in 1984, and I think at that time it was the first one north of Exeter.
I think it probably was.
The reason we got it was that I'd been thinking, without any sort of electronics expertise, about how one might have a silent practice device without any simulator attachment, simply so one could ring more without disturbing the neighbours, and was thinking of doing it with reed switches and things like that, which I think have actually been used more recently. And then two things happened. One, two students were arriving at Keele who I knew had electronics expertise and were proposing to do electronics for their degrees. And also I saw a report in the ringing world of Peter's demonstration of one of his early simulators at the Hereford course. So I wrote to Peter, I didn't know his address, I had to do it via the ringing world, and said we were thinking of having something of the sort, and was it possible for him to provide drawings and instructions so that we could build one ourselves. And his reply was that there weren't really any drawings, it was all in his head. And if we wanted, he would build one for us for the cost of the components, which would be a good deal cheaper for him to buy through the trade than we could buy them at retail prices. So he built one of his early ones for us, which was a 6-bell simulator, which had in many ways a much better interface than some of his later smarter ones, because it only had about 10 methods on it, which were selectable simply by switches on the front of the case. And at that time, you couldn't even make a bell behave like another bell. I had to build a little switchboard to enable that to be done. And we used that for a long time, including on our early Keele ringing courses. But unfortunately, it met its end because I left it plugged in one day and there was a thunderstorm and it got blown up. So then we went on to using, we borrowed Central Council simulator for a while because I was the one who persuaded the Central Council to buy simulators. And interestingly, the Cummings one that we bought was one of the later models, and the Education Committee were a bit worried about its electrical safety, quite unnecessarily, of course. But the result of that was that I took it into a friend of mine in the physics department at Keele who taught electronics, and he opened it up and said he was astonishingly impressed by the quality of the build, and there was no need to have any concerns about its electrical safety, totally unsurprisingly. But when Peter was installing our simulator in the autumn of 1984, we actually asked him if he would supply us with 7 of his photo heads rather than 6, and 6 went in the tower at Keele. And by that time, we had a single bell hung on our landing at Woodlands, which I'd hung, a half hundredweight bell. So I thought it would be fun to be able to ring that with a simulator. So we fitted that up, and the simulator we got was very portable. You could just hang it on the wall. And this is a good example of where throwaway remarks actually develop into something quite significant, because we were just setting it up. And I said to Peter, of course, you wouldn't have to have a bell up there, would you? You could have a bucket of concrete. And for a while we actually did, when the bell was taken off for possible tuning. But the result of that was that Peter really decided he would have a dumbbell, and he was the sort of guy who knew all the dimensions of his loft and the hatch that went into it. So by the time he went home, he'd actually got a design in his head for the dumbbell, which was installed in the loft of their chalet bungalow in Camelford. And the rope had to come down through the bedroom which he and Evelyn occupied, so that the bell could be rung from the hall. And Evelyn was very concerned about the idea of having a bell rope going down through the bedroom. So Peter promised her he would disguise it by running it through a Doric column. But I have to say, I never discovered whether he did that. But he said he was going to. We used to visit Peter from time to time and got very friendly with him. And I did ring at least 1/4 on that dumbbell. So later on, we moved on to having Able, and I can claim some credit for that, because as a result of having the simulator at Keele, I ran an adult education course to teach people to ring, and one of the people who joined the course was Chris Hughes. who at that time was working at ICL at Kidsgrove. So I taught him to ring, and that's basically what got him interested in the application of computers to ringing. So I've had quite a lot of involvement for quite a long time. And again, as and still use computers for learners, and we have a learners practice every week, which is simulated sound. And as I'm sure some of you know, the Keel ringing courses made extensive use of simulators as well. So we didn't have to go around the countryside ringing at lots of different towers.
Super. Thank you for that, Phil. Thank you for those reminiscences. David, I did have a question for you, if that's all right. People at the moment are sort of, obviously reflecting on what the last year has been like, and as you said at the end of your talk around Ringing Room and other sort of simulators that are now sort of very much online, and there's some people that are sort of suggesting that this might replace aspects of ringing in the tower, potentially handbell ringing, or provide different opportunities, and that ringing in the future might, I'm not saying it will replace it completely, of course, but might replace aspects of it. I just wondered what your thoughts about, again, you touched on the future of simulators, but whether you felt that might actually replace any aspect of physical ringing, or whether actually you think they're just, they actually are different things, and your sort of view is.
Yeah, they're sort of different things. I think what we've learned over the last year is that we still want to get on and meet each other and interact. Now, whether that's on the end of a bell rope or the end of a computer screen, we still want to do it. So I think some of the techniques that have developed over the last year, and Ringing Room especially, it's very well used these days. I think those are things that I hope don't die back once we get back on the end of the rope. They really are useful techniques, useful applications to have. At the moment, we don't know how ringing is going to start up again, and we're given dates, but we don't know how it's going to work exactly. So I think Ringing Room and things like that are coming around for quite a while yet, and why not? Because they've helped us all out over the last few years and the last few months, and I hope that they will continue to do so.
Super. Thank you. There's a little bit of thanks coming through into the chat box, so please make sure you have a look at that. David Baverstock has given you a nice praise. I think, yeah, quite a few things actually coming through. And the videos worked really well. I noticed Susan put some comments around the videos, and they came through nicely. So again, hopefully modern technology coming through here. I'm just going to quickly do a quick sell or a marketing event for the next couple of weeks, and then I think Joan's put herself on mute, so I'll ask her to speak. So next week we have, in fact, we're keeping on the technical aspect next week. We have Graham Thurman joining us to talk about Rosie and Robbie Robot. So his technical work there. The week after that, we have Mark Regan, again, somebody you talked about quite extensively tonight, and he's going to talk about the bells of Bow. And the week after that, we're not having a talk on Wednesday. We're going to have a beer tasting session on the Friday night to sort of, as we begin to look forward to the Easter weekend. I've put in the chat box a link, so if you're not a member of the St Martin's Guild but you're interested in our talks, have a click on that link, have a look at the future talks, and there's information on there about how to sign up to them as well, or how to sign up to our mailing list. And of course, people are very, very welcome. I say the chat box has been very quiet in terms of questions, although lots and lots of praise coming through to you, David. I've noticed Joan's unmuted herself. I don't know if you want to speak, Joan.
I haven't had any practical experience of simulators, so I'm just sort of questioning, how does the ringer connect with the simulator? Is the simulator pre-programmed for its method? And then as the ringer pulls the rope, so you hope that it sounds the same as the simulator as it dongs the bell? It's sort of connecting the practical ringer with the machine.
Sort of. And let's go back. When can you use a simulator? Well, you can use a simulator in a tower anywhere from lesson 1 up to the most advanced ringing you possibly can do. So if you imagine your first ringing lesson, you don't know the relationship between the pull and the bong, or you can put a simulator on and you will know that you pull and a fraction of a second later the bell makes a sound. So you've got that to start with. Next few lessons, you can start ringing rounds. The simulator will provide a perfect band to ring with, and it will leave one of the bell sounds out, for instance. So it will. It means that if you hear a mistake, it's yours. Which means if you want to correct that mistake, you use your ears, and the human ear is remarkably good at picking up errors in rhythm. So you can then listen for a mistake and you know it's yours, so you can do something about it. And that's what you don't get in a real tower, and that makes up for the fact that there's no other ropes going up and down in front of you. You're ringing entirely by listening to the bell. Now, consider that we ringers, we are public performers. Every pull you make in a tower is a public performance. It's heard outside. Now, the people outside, they don't care when you pull the rope. All they hear is what the bell sounds are, and they want to know that the quality of ringing is good. And non-ringers do know what's good ringing, what's bad ringing, because they know what good music is and what bad music is. So a simulator will help you develop your listening skills to make your ringing more accurate. How it works physically in a tower is you'll tie the cap of a bell to the bell outside, makes no sound at all. And then you have a sensor, like in those diagrams I showed, which then picks up the swing of the bell and then sends an electronic signal down to the computer. And it's the computer with its loudspeakers in the ringing chamber that makes the sound. So nothing's heard outside. And so you can use it for extra practice, prolonged practice. Might have a second practice night a week or third practice night a week, or any practice night a week, and you can ring past 9 o'clock as well. So the applications are pretty much endless, and it's up to the tutors and how they use it. So Phil Gay and Alan Griffin, for instance, they've been using these things for years, and they're the people who probably say more about how to use a simulator and how much improvement it makes the band as a whole. It's not just every ringer; it's the whole lot will get to, if they use a simulator to develop these listening skills. The standard of the ringing of the whole band will definitely improve.
Help with the rhythm as well.
The computer produces a perfect rhythm. So it's like ringing with a perfect band. And of course, it's a perfect band that doesn't shout at you. It doesn't get cross. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't give you an electric shock if you get it wrong. Oh, that's an idea. I'd have thought about that one. So it is the perfect learning opportunity. The only sort of minor downside is you've got nothing to see, but that's not really a downside, because rope sight is only an approximation as to when to ring. Small bells swing quicker than big bells. Bells are odd struck, as you probably know. So what you need to do is to use your eyes to get roughly in the right place in the change, and use your ears to get exactly in the right place in the change. And the simulator will help you develop those listening skills to be able to get accurate ringing.
Could it be that your bell is the only one that's going to sound, and all the other bells are? No, the other bells.
They're all computer-generated sounds.
Oh right, okay, all of them.
All of them. So you're swinging a large lump of metal, which could be a concrete bucket, as Phil was saying. It could be just a lump of metal, bell metal or steel or anything. But you're ringing that as if it was a real bell, and you're listening to real bell sounds. That makes sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yes, I couldn't quite work out the connection of the machine with the ring. Yes, thank you.
Maybe I need to do an extra paragraph at the start of my talk on explaining that.
I use a simulator. As soon as the learner can handle a bell, I get them to ring the tenor to rounds on 6. So the computer goes da 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 da, and they have to pull the rope and go ding at the right time. And one of my learners at Bloxham, he was very keen on this, and as soon as he could do that, I got him to ring the treble, which is much more difficult, and he did that. And then he wanted to learn to do plain hunt. He did that, and then to ring bob doubles inside. Then he came along one week and said, "Can I ring Stedman this week?" And I didn't know he'd been learning it. He proceeded to ring a perfect course of Stedman doubles. And the following week he said, "Can I do Cambridge this week?" And every week, a week long, he learned a new method. And this is the chap. David gave me his dumbbell, his bicycle dumbbell, and it sat in my shed for about 25 years. And I thought this chap would like it. So I got it out and set it up and gave it to him. And he now actually has it in his room at home. And but he was so keen. Unfortunately, he then said that he was going to go and do his A levels down in Somerset. So I lost him. So, but he improved the standard of our band considerably for Sundays.
Thank you for that, Alan. And hopefully your loss was Somerset's gain.
Yes,
the bigger picture of ringing.
it was, yes, Milverton.
Super. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, David, for your responses. I think with that, and I'm conscious of time, I'll wrap up tonight. So David, thank you for tonight's fascinating talk. You've given us, as I say, a really interesting history of ringing simulators and technology, and also I think some interesting biographies of both past and present of some of the real innovators and pioneers of ringing. And again, with the contributions from Phil and Alan as well, have sort of really added to the contribution that simulators can play. Again, both historically and I think particularly, as we've seen in the last year. It'll be interesting to know what the future holds for them. So thank you on behalf of all of us here tonight, and on behalf of the St Martin's Guild, thank you for coming along and speaking to us.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Phil and Alan for their contributions as well. I didn't know they were coming tonight. It's lovely to see them.
No, I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yep, very good.
Super. David, please have a quick look at the chat box. There's, as I say, lots of thanks in there. I will stop the recording and give it a minute or so and then end the meeting.